was a hearing no one saw coming. Judge Amy Coney Barrett, known for her measured tone and strong adherence to conservative judicial philosophy, had unexpectedly summoned Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to respond to allegations related to what was described as obstruction of federal oversight. The announcement alone sent shockwaves across legal and political communities. But what happened inside the courtroom would soon dominate national conversation. From the moment Jasmine Crockett entered the chamber, it was clear this wasn't going to be a typical legal formality. She walked in with unwavering confidence, her head high, her notes in hand, and her resolve carved into every step. Barrett sat elevated at the bench, robed and composed, projecting calm authority. The two women, though vastly different in ideology, had one thing in common. Neither was willing to back down. As the gavel dropped, Judge Barrett outlined the concern, claiming that Crockett's public statements and alleged coordination with protest organizers during a contentious oversight dispute might have violated federal compliance laws. Crockett didn't flinch. She responded, "This feels less like a hearing and more like a show trial meant to scare people into silence." Instantly, the mood shifted. Barrett warned her to remain respectful, but Crockett replied, "Respect is earned, not assumed, and this court has yet to earn it." Barrett continued with an air of authority, asserting that Crockett had potentially undermined a federal inquiry involving law enforcement accountability. She cited public records, social media posts, and internal memos as the foundation for this accusation. But Crockett was more than ready. She had come with a meticulously organized dossier, citing case law, constitutional protections, and internal communications that exposed the politicized nature of the investigation. "I'm not on trial because I broke the law," she stated, her voice unwavering. "I'm here because I broke the narrative you're trying to protect," Barrett interrupted, clearly agitated. "Congresswoman, this is a legal hearing, not a campaign rally." But Crockett, unfazed, replied, "Then, why does this courtroom feel like a political theater, where due process is traded for intimidation?" The gallery murmured. Some tried to quiet the tension, but it was impossible to ignore. Barrett, trying to reclaim control, called Crockett's behavior inappropriate and hinted that contempt charges were being considered. Crockett, cool as ever, looked directly at the judge and said, "You can't jail justice. You can only delay a tand. I've got time." The press captured every word. Viewers online began sharing clips within minutes. As the hearing proceeded, Barrett attempted to refocus the exchange. She brought up Crockett's presence at protests and questioned whether she had interfered with federal agents during a standoff. But Crockett came prepared with surveillance transcripts, statements from federal liaisons, and testimony from other lawmakers, proving she was there to de-escalate, not to disrupt. "You're painting me as a criminal," she said sharply. "But the only thing I'm guilty of is standing between injustice and the people it crushes." Barrett leaned forward and issued a stern warning, stating that one more outburst could lead to immediate disciplinary action. Crockett paused, took a breath, then leaned into the microphone. "The fact that truth feels like an outburst to you says more about this courtroom than it does about me." At that moment, the room froze. Barrett looked visibly unsettled. Shh, signaled to her clerks, whispering something that the mics didn't catch. But the message was clear. She was losing control of the situation. Crockett, on the other hand, stood tall and collected, her every word now echoing through the chamber and beyond. The balance of power had started to shift, not through aggression, but through the unshakable force of facts. Then came the moment that would be replayed endlessly across the internet. Barrett ordered Crockett to submit her devices for inspection, claiming they might contain communication relevant to the inquiry. Crockett, prepared for such overreach, pulled out a pre-approved federal court injunction barring exactly that action. "This," she said, holding the document up for the cameras, "was signed by a federal judge less than 48 hours ago. It blocks any unauthorized seizure of my communications." "Maybe you should have read it before this charade began." Barrett's composure visibly cracked. She tried to dismiss the injunction as irrelevant, but Crockett cited the law section by section, making it clear she wasn't just defiant, she was legally bulletproof. The courtroom buzzed louder than ever. Barrett raised her voice slightly, demanding order, but the control she once had was slipping. Crockett continued, It's ironic, isn't it? A judge so obsessed with the Constitution doesn't recognize when it's standing right in front of her. Barrett's gavel slammed down, her frustration finally boiling over. "This is my courtroom," she shouted. Crockett, staring her down, responded calmly, "And this is my country, and I'm not leaving quietly." Unable to contain the political and legal fallout, Judge Barrett abruptly called for a recess. Legal analysts later revealed she likely did so to consult with senior judicial advisors about how to proceed without causing irreversible public damage. During the break, Crockett stepped outside and was immediately met with reporters, activists, and supporters who had been following the live stream. Her brief remarks outside the courtroom were simple, yet impactful. "If standing up gets me jailed, then let it be known I stood for something." Inside, Barrett reportedly argued with her clerks behind closed doors, weighing the consequences of jailing a sitting congresswoman amid a growing public outcry. By the time the session resumed, the tone was radically different. Barrett, now measured but visibly irritated, stated that no decision would be made about further sanctions until after a full judicial review. Crockett smirked. "Translation?" she said under her breath, loud enough for the mic to catch. "You've been checkmated." Barrett ignored the jab, but the damage had been done. Crockett's supporters online exploded with praise, while critics of the court's behavior questioned the very legitimacy of the proceedings. The moment had grown bigger than either woman. It had become symbolic. What began as a procedural legal hearing had turned into a national spectacle. Within hours, news networks were broadcasting the exchange nonstop, with legal analysts debating whether Judge Barrett had stepped outside the bounds of her authority. Even some conservative commentators admitted the optics were damaging, while progressive voices hailed Crockett as a modern-day icon of resistance. In Congress, several lawmakers issued statements in support of her, calling the hearing a dangerous misuse of judicial authority meant to intimidate dissent. Civil liberties organizations demanded an ethics review into Judge Barrett's conduct. And within 24 hours, a petition began circulating demanding accountability from the bench. Meanwhile, Crockett's following on social media exploded. Words were quoted, remixed into protest chants, and even turned into viral audio clips. But through all the noise, Crockett remained grounded. She didn't gloat. Instead, she issued a message urging Americans to stay focused on policy, on voting, on fighting for real systemic change. "This wasn't about me," she tweeted. "It was about what happens when truth threatens power." That post alone racked up millions of impressions. As the dust began to settle, it became clear that Judge Barrett's attempt to reprimand Jasmine Crockett had backfired spectacularly. Not only had the Congresswoman refused to be silenced, she had exposed serious flaws in how justice was being administered in politically sensitive cases. Legal scholars began referencing the exchange in law journals, framing it as a pivotal moment in the tension between judicial conservatism and grassroots legislative activism. Barrett issued no further statements, and court officials refused to take media questions. It was as though the system was quietly trying to contain the blaze, but it was too late. The confrontation had already become legend, a defining example of what happens when an institution used to deference meets a woman unwilling to kneel. Crockett, for her part, continued doing her work. She returned to Congress, more respected and more determined than ever. Her staff described her as fired up, but focused. She knew this was bigger than a single court hearing. It was a signal to the judiciary, to Congress, and to the people that silence is not always an option. In the weeks following, a wave of public engagement followed. Voter registration groups saw surges in sign-ups, and young activists cited Crockett's stand as their inspiration. Even educators began using the courtroom footage in civic classes, framing it as a modern-day example of speaking truth to power. While Barrett remained silent, her reputation took a visible hit. Once seen as unshakably poised, she was now perceived by many as having miscalculated her authority. Meanwhile, Crockett was invited to speak at universities, conferences, and civil rights gatherings. At each appearance, she reiterated that her fight wasn't about ego, it was about accountability. "Too often," she said during a televised town hall, "we're told to sit quietly in rooms built to exclude us. I chose not to whisper. The audience erupted in applause. Her message resonated far beyond the courtroom walls, echoing across the country like a battle cry. Even months later, political commentators continued to reference the incident as a turning point. Some viewed it as a symbolic crack in the armor of unchecked judicial power. Others saw it as the beginning of a bridge,